They call it black gold. It fuels our cars, heats our homes, and for well over a century, it's been at the very heart of, well, everything: war, peace, global power. This is the story of petroleum, a substance that has literally defined the modern world in ways we often don't even realize. So, how did this even happen? How did this goopy black liquid trapped deep under the ground climb its way to become the single most critical commodity on the planet? How did it get to shape entire nations and basically dictate the flow of history? All right, let's get into it. Our story kicks off not thousands of years ago, but actually pretty recently. We're talking the mid-19th century, when a few key innovations turned oil from this kind of local oddity into a full-blown global obsession. First up, we got modern drilling. But the real explosion came in 1901 at a place called Spindletop in Texas. A massive gusher just erupted, and that really launched the era of huge-scale oil production. Suddenly, oil products were available everywhere. But it was World War I that really truly cemented oil's importance. The war began with cavalry charges, but it ended with tanks, trucks, and airplanes. And all of them were thirsty for oil. This quote from the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, just nails it. He said, "The Allied cause had floated to victory on a wave of oil." All of a sudden, controlling oil wasn't just about making money. It was literally about national survival. So after the World Wars, oil's role just escalated. It became the actual foundation of our modern industrial society. The world didn't just want oil anymore, it absolutely needed it. The economic boom after the war was just staggering. And it was all thanks to these huge new oil fields in the Middle East, where it cost pennies on the dollar to produce. So oil was incredibly cheap and it was everywhere. This cheap energy is what fueled the so-called economic miracles in places like Europe and Japan. And the result? Global oil consumption more than doubled in just 12 years, from 1960 to 1972. Just think about this for a second. By 1973, petroleum made up a full 50% of all the energy used on the entire planet. We had built a whole civilization that ran on one single resource. But there was a huge shift happening just beneath the surface. So the United States, this was the country that had been the world's great oil stabilizer. They supplied 6 out of every 7 barrels to the Allies in World War II. But by 1971, they were running out of extra capacity. The wells in Texas were pumping at 100%, and it still wasn't enough. The world's biggest producer had become the world's biggest importer, and that created a vulnerability that absolutely no one was prepared for. And that, right there, brings us to the 1970s. This was the decade that was going to expose that vulnerability in the most dramatic way you can imagine. The world was about to get a very painful lesson in the geopolitics of oil. It was a really simple, brutal equation. The world was totally addicted, and for the first time ever, the suppliers decided to just turn off the tap. The whole thing was triggered by the Yom Kippur War in October 1973. To retaliate for American support for Israel, Arab oil exporting nations declared an embargo. They cut production, they stopped shipments. This wasn't just a political statement, it was an economic weapon. And by December, the cartel we know as OPEC seized the moment and quadrupled the price of oil. The results? Pure chaos. We're talking economic recession, those infuriatingly long gas lines, and a global panic that totally shattered the illusion of endless, cheap energy. And just when the world was kind of catching its breath, boom, it happened again. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution brought the country's oil fields to a standstill, taking nearly 5 million barrels of daily production offline almost overnight. Now, even though other countries tried to make up the difference, the market panicked. Everyone was afraid of another shortage, so nations started hoarding oil. It created this frenzy of panic buying that made prices more than double. Again, the 1-2 punch was complete. So these shocks sent these massive waves through all the countries that used oil. But they also had this really strange and often devastating effect on the countries that produced the oil. This is what people call the paradox of plenty. So this is a really crucial idea, the resource curse. It sounds totally backwards, right? You'd think that finding $1 trillion worth of oil under your country would be like winning the ultimate lottery. But what the data shows is that countries with all this natural wealth often end up with slower growth, more corruption, and just worse social outcomes than countries that have very few resources. And the data's pretty stark. Between 1970 and 1993, and remember, this period had massive oil booms, Developing countries with few resources grew on average 4 times faster than resource-rich ones. I mean, how is that even possible? Well, the flood of oil money often makes the local currency too strong, which kills other exports. And of course, it can fuel corruption that just hollows out the government from the inside. I mean, just look at Nigeria. Over a 25-year period, the country made more than $300 billion in oil revenue. You'd think poverty would have disappeared. Instead, the percentage of people living in absolute poverty skyrocketed from 27% to a staggering 66%. The oil money wasn't a blessing at all. For many, it was a curse.
But here's the thing. The curse isn't inevitable. Take Norway, for instance. They found oil in the North Sea and used that wealth to build one of the most prosperous and stable societies on Earth. They invested it for the long haul in a giant national savings fund. Nigeria, on the other hand, was just plagued by corruption and bad governance, and the wealth got squandered. So the difference isn't the oil, it's the institutions you have in place to manage it.
Okay, so the shocks of the 70s and this reality of the resource curse completely reshaped the global energy landscape. They basically created a whole new oil map. After getting held hostage twice in a single decade, you can bet the world was desperate to break OPEC's stranglehold. This kicked off a massive, worldwide hunt for new oil reserves, anywhere but the Middle East. It didn't matter how difficult or expensive they were to get to. And you know what? They found them. Giant fields came online in the super harsh environment of the North Sea, on the frozen tundra of Prudhoe Bay in Alaska, and deep under the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. These new projects were technological marvels, and they started to diversify the global supply, chipping away at the power of the old producers. But the biggest game changer of all, that was something almost nobody saw coming. It wasn't some new discovery in a far-flung corner of the globe. It was a technological breakthrough right in America's own backyard that would completely redraw the energy map. The key was combining two technologies. First, horizontal drilling. This let drillers turn their wells sideways and follow these thin layers of oil-rich rock for miles. And second, hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, which uses this high-pressure fluid to crack that rock open and release the oil and gas that had been trapped in there for millions of years. And the impact was, well, it was nothing short of a revolution. The U.S., the country that had become so dangerously dependent on foreign oil, saw its net imports fall to just 27% of what it used, the lowest level since 1985. The shale boom completely upended global energy politics. It weakened OPEC's influence, it challenged countries like Russia, and it turned the world's biggest consumer back into a production powerhouse with a ton of new strategic flexibility. So, from Spindletop all the way to the shale fields, oil has been the undisputed king. It's fueled economies and defined global conflicts for more than 100 years. But this new era, with American energy abundance and a growing global push away from fossil fuels, it brings up a whole new set of questions. The age of oil defined the 20th century, for sure. The big question now is, what's going to define the 21st?